he was really keen on spreading the message, and so he was very influential in doing publicity for us. Things were looking very good. It looked like the number of people who were expressing interest would fill not only the cafe but the whole of Castle Street. So we were very, very hopeful. Unfortunately, so we then investigated using Stockport Rugby Club, which interestingly is actually in Bramhall, so a bit far out, not in the centre of Stockport. And we were still very much ready to go. And then suddenly Time for Food pulled out. So we lost that, one of our key sponsors. And when we investigated the costs of using the rugby club and various things, we decided to cancel. However, in 2017, in March of 2017, our then chair, Luke, and our able, remember there, Stephen, take a bow, it was suggested that we would have another go at running Stockport Pride because of the support shown online. This was discussed with the committee members of Plus, and we agreed to support the event. In memoriam of Martin, we decided to call the stage set the Martin Het stage, and Martin's family did a speech on the day. Foodie Friday led the rainbow gazebo for the day, which was a nice gesture. We had 13 volunteers, mainly from Plus, on the event. Granada Reports came and interviewed people about the event, so that was certainly regional coverage. In October, Luke and Stephen attended the UK Pride Organisers Network in Blackpool, and after the first event, it was decided to establish Stockport Pride as a separate organisation. 2018 was our first Pride Parade on the 29th of July. We started outside the cinema at Red Rock. We went through Suffragette Square, which is between Red Rock and Princess Street, through Merseyway, and then up to the marketplace. The group had attracted by that time other sponsors, including principally the Stockport Council, who helped us obviously to get the marketplace, which was our venue. We started selling Pride merchandise, thanks to a person trading under the name of Taste the Rainbow. Proud to be parents, ran a space for young children as part of the event within Staircase House. Our number of volunteers increased to 50, and the number of stalls increased to 40. So we had stalls outside the market hall and inside the market hall, with a huge range of commercial and voluntary organisations helping us out. So I think that was a very sunny day, wasn't it, Stephen? So we had blazing sunshine. It was a gorgeous day, so everybody was having a really good time. A lot of the local pubs had actually come on our side to sponsor the event, so they did quite a roaring business. We had food stalls, so a really, really good event. So the next one is 2019, which is on the 28th of July. We did yet another parade, but my memories of the day, it was an extremely wet day. In fact, it was very akin to yesterday. So literally, we started the parade in light rain, and as the day went on, it was torrential rain. But because we'd actually had things in the market hall, people could shelter. Quite a lot of people were sheltering in the pubs and supporting us that way. There was a festival of film put on by the Light Cinema in Red Rock and Stockport Plaza. We also, thanks to our good friends at the library, we had a talk by the local author L.M. Creer, the creator of Ted Darling, a gay detective who lives in Stockport and works for the Stockport police. And so there was a book signing, and people could buy the books. They're quite interesting books, self-published by the author, and had photographs of Stockport in them on the front. But I'm not going to quibble about their literary value, but they're quite enjoyable. And 2020, obviously we've got COVID, and but the high point is that we're going to celebrate Global Pride on the 27th of June on 2020. Pride had registered as a charitable incorporated organisation on the 31st of March. Unfortunately, we had to cancel the event, which is a great blow to us. Interpride, Europride, UK PON, and other Pride organisations come together to hold an online Pride event, Global Pride. Stockport Pride submits a speech by Stephen, which was broadcast online through YouTube and Facebook as part of the event. 2021, yet another event cancelled by COVID. So the thing was badged as Greater Manchester Digital Pride, which was held on 25th of September. Number of Pride organisations in Greater Manchester, as along with Carl Austin Vian, come to organise an online event. Stockport Pride submits videos from musicians and community groups which were broadcast online through YouTube as part of the event. Positive thing happening in 2021 is that we hold our first in-person public event since the start of the COVID-19 pandemic, which is a Halloween party held at Disability Stockport, and had a pretty good turnout, some excellent costumes, and we had a competition for best costume, which was difficult. And actually, a member of Plus, well, most of the people there were from Plus, so it was obvious that somebody from Plus possibly would win the event, and he did so. And I hope I'm racing through this. I'm going to have questions after this, or questions after all the talks?
Questions after your talk is probably best, isn't it?
Yeah. And 2022, right, we're looking with optimism to holding the event on the Sunday, the 31st of July 2020, and the planning has already started. 2022, yes, thank you, Stephen, for that. It's almost like my stage manager is giving me the cues there. So onwards and upwards, and I hope the weather will be nice for us, and we can start, from this very, from a really good start when everything was really running well, to COVID, which has affected everybody in a really dramatic way. And so thanks very much for listening, and any questions?
I have a slight question. Which Halloween costume won?
It was a person dressed as a dinosaur, I seem to remember. Or was it? We got...
It was a member of Forward, Philippa, who was dressed as a woman who had been murdered by a cat and then came back to...
All right, I got the entire... I must have mixed this with the entirely other... But it's... Yeah, oh, well, that's even better one. And I don't know if there's any photos of said murdered by a cat. Yeah, that will be good. So that's... To do a bit of historical research, that would be ideal, to find the spirit of the murdered cat and indeed the person. Any... Jeff?
Congratulations, that was a fascinating insight. What makes it all the more remarkable is there is very little archive for people to actually find out about. Probably presented a unique insight that doesn't exist anywhere else. Are there any plans by your organisation to archive any of this material for future generations?
Yeah. Yeah, Jeff, as in our earlier conversation, we said we've realised that there's a bit of a gap in the thing, because we've or especially doing minutes online, often you don't save them. Except for people who are a bit obsessional like myself, who actually has saved quite a lot of the minutes. Also, Stephen has been an absolute incredible research assistant in finding like minutes dating back to our very early years, because the initial title of my discussion was going to be the history of Plus, and it was going to be a tale of 3 logos, because we've changed our logos literally 3 times. And the first one, which that'll be saved for another out in the past, but the first one was very, very corporate and quite dull. We then changed to the rainbow viaduct colour, which I think is very eye-catching. And now we've rebranded again in 2019 to a more explanatory thing, which is linked to our website. So the website itself is actually themed. So we have an activity page, we have an organising page, we have a social page, and literally an online page. So we have, and I think if we looked how the group survived during COVID, that we put our social online, and basically we're doing it via Zoom. And anybody who's taken part in a Zoom quiz, while it's interesting, it certainly does have the atmosphere. So, okay, anything else? Any other questions?
You did mention Pride is happening again. So are you, if somebody is within the Stockport area or the Greater Manchester area, is there somebody, are you welcoming volunteers?
We definitely always welcome volunteers. Obviously, our volunteer pool has been in hibernation, so we need to reactivate that. Some of those volunteers won't be available now. So yes, anybody's welcome. There is a Pride website, which has got details, and also there's the Plus website, or LGBT Plus website. So both of those have contact things, so you either do it via one or the other, or both, if you want to.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
So a very big vote of thanks to Andy for stepping in to give us a valuable insight to some of our local LGBT plus history. Thank you very much, Andy. We are now moving on to a video element of our talk. The next speaker that we are welcoming is Alex Holmes, who's a PhD student at the University of Leeds. She's found herself working somewhere between biophysics and biochemistry to find out how tiny parts of the body function. And when she isn't busy hacking into supercomputers or complaining about experiments not working, she's very active in scientific research and sharing the experience of being bi inside. She wants to introduce and reintroduce to you various scientists and delve into their secret lives. And then ask yourself the question, why is there a precedent to keep sexuality and science separate? So I will now introduce our recording from Alex, which is The Secret Life of Scientists. Thank you.
Just give me a minute. No, where's there we go. Where is she?
Go back. The joys of technical.
No. Is she that one?
No.
Nope, sorry. We're trying again here.
There are drinks and snacks if you want to get them.
It's
on
this
the
one,
chat
right?
as well.
Is that one?
Yes.
Absolutely, sort of a rainbow way experiencing technical difficulties.
The joys of hybrid events are very much in evidence here.
Let's try this again. Sorry, folks. No, Windows. Is she this one?
We've just done that.
But it's not there. Okay, I'm gonna try that one. Where's optimize for? Here we go. Fingers crossed, folks.
Right. And here we have Alex Holmes. Thank you.
We can start it over once we get the volume worked out.
So I've been invited by Out in the Park to do a talk on the secret lives of scientists.
Is that good in the back?
And I know it's a little
Okay,
bit
we'll start that over.
There's just so much here that I can talk about.
We can hear in the
I'm
room.
Alex Holmes. I use she, her pronouns. I identify as bisexual. For anyone who needs an audio description, I'm a white woman in my mid-20s with shoulder-length brown hair and a big smile on my face. I'm so excited to have the opportunity to give this talk today. So I've been invited by Out in the Park to give a talk on the secret lives of scientists. And I know it's a bit of a vague title, there's just so much here that I can talk about. But I'm hoping you'll leave this talk with an insight into how identity and science kind of interact with each other. So I'd like to start this just with a bit of a game. There's you don't need to keep score unless you're feeling particularly competitive. But how many famous LGBTQ+ people do you think you can name? Now, in my case, I'm thinking of like Freddie Mercury, Elton John, Oscar Wilde, Elliot Page. You know, quite a few like pop culture references there. But you're really interested to know who you're thinking of. So let's come to round two, slightly more difficult. How many famous scientists could you name? Now, I get a bit of an advantage here because I am a scientist. But you might be thinking people like Albert Einstein, Stephen Hawking, Marie Curie, Katherine Johnson, you have plenty of names to pick from. Final question of this round, a bit more specific. Where do these categories overlap? Who is LGBTQ+ and a famous scientist? Now, this is definitely trickier, and I will revisit some potential answers later on in my talk. But for now, I'm going to leave you a question to kind of mull over in your mind throughout the rest of my talk. And that's, why might there be a lack of openly LGBTQ+ scientists? Okay, let's get into it. Science and sexuality. You might have heard that you're like born gay, or there's a gay gene. I think there's an Avenue song that references gay being in your DNA. This also gets a bit confusing when you actually get into the science. So I've got here three kind of headlines from scientific articles over, I think, the last kind of, I don't know, 20, 25 years, depending on whether or not you believe that 1993 was that long ago. And they're all talking about kind of genetic patterns, DNA markers, and gay genes, and how these kind of offer clues to the evolution of sexuality. Now, two of these say that there are markers for this, and one says that there isn't. Now, one of the main things that these three studies have in common is that they use one of the kind of biggest scientific techniques over the last 20 years, which is genetic sequencing. This is where you get all of like genetic material and DNA from plants, animal, human, and you work out exactly what the code is, and then you link that up to what it does. Now, this is really powerful. It's given us a lot of information about the way life works. It's also powerful because it can tell us the difference between groups of people using these like big association studies. And then it can link differences between groups up to their genetics. And it's like a pretty cool concept, but investigating these differences is not only difficult because it requires like a huge amount of data, it can also be pretty problematic when it comes to the outcomes of the research. So most research, particularly biology, which is where I'm based, needs to have real world applications, particularly if you're kind of fighting money to do the research. So what is the application of performing research to identify a gay gene? I mean, perhaps it started with good intentions, such as to give like credibility to LGBTQ+ identities. But some of the applications can be more insidious than this. DNA markers and things like this are really good way of screening people. And I don't know if you really want to be screening people when it comes to LGBTQ+ individuals. I've got two headlines here. One says, is there a gay gene? The problem with studies connecting genetics and LGBTQ identity. And then its kind of subtitle is, we won't fix the ongoing problems in the LGBTQ community for discovering one or more gay genes, and there are compelling reasons why we should even try. This is a really good, interesting article. And then I have a second one, it's from the Daily Mail in 1993, that says, abortion hopes after gay genes findings. So, what are the implications of being able to screen people for sexuality? I mean, the Daily Mail clearly had an idea of what it wanted to do with those results. And at the end of the day, we know queer people exist, so why do we need to find a basis for it? And why are we treating it like a new phenomenon? I think is a pretty good question to be asking it. And looking at the natural world, there's quite a lot of evidence that this isn't a new phenomenon. So I've got a couple of stats here. To date, same-sex behaviour has been reported in over 450 species. Now, you'll notice I'm being really careful to say same-sex behaviour here. That's because we can't actually claim that an animal has the same understanding of sexuality or gender as humans. You might notice if I slip up in the later slides, I will try and correct myself. But when I refer to animals, same-sex behaviour. We also see sex changes, naturally animals. I've got fish to chickens on this slide. I didn't know chickens change sex. I think that's really interesting. I want more people to know. And you also see intersex individuals in so many different species. And we've seen this for as long as we've been looking for it, which is a pretty long time. It's definitely not news. So I'm not entirely sure why we treat it like that. Oh, actually, that's a lie. I kind of do know why we treat it like that. And it's just like we see in other fields. Queer history gets erased or deliberately obscured. And I'm going to walk you through an example of that. So we're going to talk about Dr. George Murray Landic. He was one scientist on Captain Scott's 1910 to 1913 expedition to the Antarctic. Now, he was there a pretty long time, far longer than they planned to. This meant that he got to witness the entire breeding cycle of that Adelaide penguin, which is something no one had researched before. So you're probably like, oh, what a cool thing to, come home and tell everyone that you saw, right? Well, not in George's eyes. He noticed depraved sexual acts performed by these penguins. Some of these were pretty dark, and I'm not going to go into the details of that. But others were just simply that same-sex behaviour that we were talking about. And he was so horrified by this that he would only write about these acts in Greek in his notebook so that other people wouldn't be able to find out about it. And when he did come back to England and tried to tell people, these observations weren't allowed to be published. Now, you might be thinking, well, we just didn't know about, penguins having sex, that's fine, that's not like groundbreaking research. But actually hiding this meant that it took another 50 years until his behaviour was rediscovered. So not only are we kind of losing evidence of same-sex behaviour in animals, but we're making more work for ourselves. We're having to send even more people out to the Antarctic to study penguin breeding, and not that many people want to spend 2 years out in the cold. But what about now? That was the 1910s. So how do we react to same-sex behaviour in animals now? Well, definitely treated it differently. It's not hidden away, but it seems like it's celebrated a lot more. Become kind of like feel-good stories in the news. So here we've got a bisexual goose in New Zealand called Thomas. And he was kind of treated as a novelty. He became like a queer icon, I suppose. But I did a lot of research here. And according to a study in Nature, about 15 to 20% of geese engage in same-sex behaviour. That's about 1 in 5. So it's not that uncommon that geese are doing this. Thomas wasn't special. Well, I'm sure he was special, but he wasn't special for his sexuality. And it's interesting. You might be asking at this point, well, why are we surprised these behaviours in animals then? Why are we surprised when it's clearly so prevalent? Well, I have a little bit of an explanation here. It's probably not the whole story, but it's the bit that kind of resonates with me. And that's that it goes against the status quo. I like to think of science as like a staircase where each new step is built on top of what came before. And it looks sturdy, and you want to keep climbing up it. But if someone came along and started pointing out kind of cracks and flaws in the early steps of the staircase, you might not start fully trusting it anymore, and you might not trust the later steps either. And that's kind of the case here. So we're going to go back to Darwin's theory of evolution. I'm sure most of you have heard of it. Basically it says, creatures that are best adapted to their environment are the ones that will survive, be able to reproduce, and those genes and traits are the ones that will continue to be inherited. But this relies on offspring to inherit those traits, and this definitely conflicts with part of the population not reproducing but continuing to exist in the form of LGBTQ+ individuals. So there's a bit of conflict here, and I'm not saying that the two totally oppose each other. There's actually quite interesting research into why evolutionary it might be useful to have part of the population not reproducing, but it still kind of contradicts it in some ways. And you can see why it would cause some uncomfortable questions to scientists. Like if you're still building out the staircase and someone's pointing out to the bottom ones and your assumptions, that can be quite uncomfortable. And overall, it's better to start with a really strong foundation for this, not a slightly shaky one. So let's revisit that question I asked about the lack of openly LGBTQ+ scientists. Firstly, I have a bit of hypothetical. If historically we had included and celebrated queer scientists, do you think there'd be the same interest in a gay gene or same-sex behaviour in animals? I like to kind of think on that one. There's specific societal pressures in many workplaces that can make it uncomfortable to be out. In my own experience, science can have specific other factors. So typically there's a separation between the scientist and the subject of the experiment, whether it's clinical trial volunteers having codes rather than using names, so that you don't know whose data you have. Or maybe you're working with another species because of ethical concerns and things. So to an extent, it lets you take your own biases and beliefs out of the experiment. And this can be useful, but actually your worldview dictates the kind of scientific questions you might ask. So for example, I might not be asking, is there a gene for bisexuality? Because I know I'm bisexual and that, if that's not to do with my DNA, that's fine. I'm not too curious about what that is to do with. And then interpreting the results of studies, that definitely you have your own biases and beliefs into it. And then in particular, how all of that then gets translated into society at large. If there had been queer rights for the Daily Mail, maybe that headline wouldn't have gone out in the way that it has. So I think this is a really important point. And if you're unable to separate yourself from your research subjects, either because you identify with the research or your colleagues, seniors, role models identify with them, it can be really hard to treat your study population just as research subjects. It's a whole thing that you have to kind of grapple with. But we can't really access the world in which there have been historical inclusion and celebration of queer scientists. But we can play a part in kind of changing that narrative. So I'd really like to introduce you to some LGBTQ+ scientists, mostly historical, but kind of contemporary, that we can celebrate now and start changing that narrative. So, firstly, Sarah. She was alive in the last century and she identified as lesbian. And she's actually known for tracking down Typhoid Mary when there was a big typhoid epidemic. She didn't just track down once, she tracked down twice, which is quite impressive. And she did a lot of work with the immigrant community in New York and really advocated for them. And she was one of the first people to draw attention to the role of poverty in health. This is cool, this is something that we still struggle to do at the moment. So it's cool that she was doing this back then. Next, I'd really like for you to meet Alan. He was alive between 1890 and 1962, and after being assigned female at birth, he transitioned to living as a man. This included undergoing a hysterectomy, and he also started undergoing hormonal therapy in 1920. And that's quite cool because hormonal therapy only really became an option in 1920, so he's a real pioneer here. He worked studying tuberculosis, and he developed a method of detecting disease using X-rays to the chest. And that's gone on to be used to diagnose and treat thousands of patients. So that's a huge impact. And I've also included this quote from him because I just think it's lovely. It says, "Happier since I made this change than I ever have in my life, and I'll continue this way as long as I live." Which I think is just a really powerful way of articulating how important transition is to people. Next, a more contemporary and maybe familiar face. So Sally died recently, and upon her death, her long-term partner of 27 years was revealed to be a woman, despite being married to a male astronaut earlier in her life. She's particularly cool because she was the first American woman to go to space and the youngest person in space until last year's SpaceX flight. And it's interesting because she faced plenty of pushback over her gender. I think you've heard that report or myth about NASA asking a female astronaut how many tampons she needs to take into space. Well, Sally faced really similar questions. She was asked about how space travel would affect her reproductive organs. So it's really cool that you kind of got through that and was able to make such an impact on astro science. Now I'm going to talk about Paul. So Paul was a Hungarian mathematician and considered to be asexual, and he was the subject of a book called The Man Who Loved Only Numbers. He loved them so much he actually spent all his waking hours working on them, which might explain how so many papers in the mathematics field are published by him. He published 1,500. That's a really, really big number. That is actually his record. And just a little bit of context, I've been in science since 2018, and I've published 3, so he's definitely beaten that. And he's actually considered like the Kevin Bacon of maths. So you know how you can use Kevin Bacon to describe how far removed one actor or actress is from Kevin Bacon, they started in this film with so and so, started in this film, we started with Kevin Bacon. We can do that with Paul. People do that with papers, oh, so and so worked with them, you work with them, publish with them, publish with Paul. So I just think that's really impressive. There's so many other people that I would absolutely love to talk about now, and I don't want to go way over my time limit. But I really recommend looking at the interviews that LGBTQ+ STEM have on their website. I've put the pardon me. I've put the link on this slide. And they have interviews on their website with active scientists in the LGBTQ+ community. I think it's just really important that we support and celebrate people now. We don't wait until kind of 50 years and after they finish working. We do it now, and we use them as role models for now. So have a look at these, celebrate them, and let's take a step towards adjusting the interaction between science and sexuality. Thank you so much for listening. I'll leave it there. I'm Alex Holmes, and I hope I've left you wanting to know more about the secret lives of scientists.
There we
And in a flawless transition back to live, hello everybody and welcome back. We've got a couple of questions that we are wondering if our audience in the room and out online might be interested in. One of them is, how many famous LGBT people do you actually know and can you think of? So that was her first question. How many LGBT plus people do you know out in the world? What are famous names? Anybody think, what kind of names come to your mind when asked that question? So, yes, celebrities are definitely sort of that way with me. I've got Ian McClellan, I always remember. That's one of mine. Anybody else? Any thoughts? What names come to your mind? Famous LGBT plus personalities.
Jack Morrow.
Sorry?
Jack Morrow.
Jack Morrow.
Monroe.
Monroe. I'm great sometimes, aren't I? So a lot of the personalities, as Alex mentioned, they are famous on TV or radio or film, and we do not make that science connection. Can anybody think of a famous, or more than one, famous LGBT plus scientist that hasn't already been mentioned by Alex? Alan Turing. That was the only one I could think of. So I think,
according to some historians, Sir Isaac Newton.
yes, Sir Isaac Newton is. Leonardo da Vinci, yes. There's a lot less names tend to come to mind. So I think Alex widened our knowledge there in a very valuable way. I don't know if there's anybody out there online who can think of more. I welcome you to rack your brains and try and think. So a massive thank you to Alex for doing that. We have now got a few frequently asked questions from her, so we will share that video. After that, we will be going to a short comfort break. So we've got about 5 minutes of questions that Alex answered that she thought people might be burning to ask, but she wasn't here to tell you.
It's not that one. I had them all ready to go, I promise. This one. Okay.
Hi, so I'm not able to be there today. Unfortunately, I'm...
Give me a minute. Let's try that again. Okay, share screen. Let's hope it's that one. Here we go.
Hi, so I'm not able to be there today. Unfortunately, I'm in San Francisco at a conference being a bisexual scientist. But I wanted to answer some frequently asked questions and hopefully start a bit of a discussion. So one of the frequently asked questions that I get is, are there any LGBTQ plus scientists you were surprised to find out were queer? And one of these actually is not so much that I was surprised to find out that they were queer, it's that I was surprised to find out that they might not be. And this was Isaac Newton. So it's quite a famous, he never got married, he never kind of had a girlfriend, he must have been gay. And I grew up thinking okay, yeah, that makes sense. And then I looked into him a bit more and looked into kind of why people were coming up with this conclusion. And found that actually there's no clear-cut evidence that there weren't kind of love letters written to men, there weren't diary entries. So now there's a bit of maybe he was asexual. What I really realised is it's pretty difficult to assign people identities kind of posthumously. So yeah, I think he's the one I was surprised by. I thought it was far more clear cut than it was. It's kind of a lesson in not assigning identity. And chances are that he wouldn't have identified as gay or asexual just because they didn't have that understanding of identity there. Another question, is there anybody that's an LGBTQ plus scientist I am particularly in admiration of or influenced by? And I've gone a bit local to me, so I'm from the University of Leeds, and I picked out there's David Smith at the University of York. He's very big on Twitter, but he's written a couple of think pieces about being an LGBTQ plus scientist, and that kind of really resonated with me. And also Izzy Yarasinger, she's based at the University of Sheffield now, but I work with her when she's at the University of Leeds. And she also has written think pieces, particularly about intersections of kind of identity and how that can influence the way that you are, in science. And that actually kind of brings me on to another question I get asked a lot. So I talked a bit about kind of being an LGBTQ plus scientist and how that intersects with the research. But this is true for a lot of other identities too. So, if you're a BAME scientist, then people studying differences in races and things can be quite uncomfortable too. If you are fat and people are studying obesity and things like this, that can also be quite an uncomfortable subject. So it's definitely not just a queer scientist experience, it's far more things than that. So I also want to talk about finding a community as an LGBTQ plus scientist. And I struggle a little bit because you might not want to out yourself and other people might not want to out themselves. You're kind of all quietly trying to work out who is who. But I found once you kind of join the LGBTQ plus staff network, and also on Twitter, kind of being openly out was quite a useful way to meet more and more people that were having similar experiences. And then that LGBTQ plus InSTEM organisation I mentioned, they organised quite a few get-togethers and conferences and things, and that's just really lovely. And I think there's quite a few organisations like that you can go to and be a queer scientist safely with other queer scientists. So yeah, thank you so much for listening to my talk and listening to me answer some questions. I really happily answer some more if you got in touch with me. So thank you.
So big thanks to Alex there for a fascinating and insightful talk about an area I have never considered before. I think Outing the Past is a wonderful vehicle for making you consider hidden aspects of LGBTQ plus history, and we thank her for that. We are now going for a 15-minute comfort break, and we will be back with you very shortly with our 2 remaining speakers. So we'll see you very soon. Seats and settling back down for our second half, please.
Words from our leader.
Hello and welcome back everybody to Outing the Past at Stockport Libraries. We are about to start our second half. I hope everybody is refreshed, renewed and ready to roll. In a moment of absolute brilliance, I thought I would mix proceedings up slightly, and we are now going to play you the welcome video from one of the esteemed leads of Outing the Past, Sue Saunders. So over to Sue with her welcome.
Yep, this one.
I want to welcome you to Outing the Past. My name is Sue Saunders. I'm the co-chair of Schools Out UK. Now, Outing the Past came out of the work that Schools Out does, and also, of course, we were the beginners of LGBT History Month. Now, Dr. Jeff Evans, who was a member of the committee, after 10 years of LGBT History Month, said, "We're losing the focus of history." And he came up with this idea of having a specific festival for LGBT history. And it has grown over the years. So we've got over 30 hubs this year. I'm so excited when I've looked at the offer. The full diversity of the presentations are amazing. And obviously Outing the Past is part of LGBT History Month. So you've got 2 websites to have a look at, the History Month website and the Outing the Past website. And also you've got a chance to buy a badge for LGBT History Month. Give yourself a lift, get yourself a badge. They're really important. They fund all the work that Schools Out does. Outing the Past, LGBT History Month, the classroom, all of that is done by unpaid volunteers, funded by the selling of our badges and lanyards. Have a great session. Look forward to seeing you in the future. Bye.
So, and a big shout out to Sue, who I think may be out there online. Hello, Sue, if you're out there. And don't forget about those very lovely badges.
I am. Thank you.
And in a very, very fortunate follow-on from that, we are now welcoming the aforementioned Dr. Jeff Evans as our next speaker. So Jeff is the founder and director of Outing the Past and coordinator of the Pink Guide project. And he is currently a visiting research fellow at LJMU and designer of the Chesters module that trains PGCE teacher trainers how to deliver LGBT plus classroom history lessons. He is also the project coordinator of Queering the North exhibitions, which is the first retrospective showcase of LGBT plus activism during the Irish Troubles. Basically a very, very busy man, so we are very delighted that he found time to squeeze Stockport Libraries in here and come and talk to us today. So welcome to Jeff with his talk, Challenging Bigotry in a Time of AIDS.
I've got a marker to stand on, so
No.
the camera works. Okay. Right. I'll just wait for the setup here.
Yeah.
Okay.
There we go. I need to just take you through with the arrow button.
Thank you very much
Okay.
indeed. Cheers. I'd just echo firstly Sue's comments, my co-coordinator of this festival, and congratulate Stockport Libraries for hosting yet again another hub. My talk today is specifically concerning the project I was involved in, and Shelley just mentioned, when I was an undergraduate in the dinosaur days, concerning, well, related to the AIDS pandemic of the 90s, late 80s. I should declare at first that association, so I'm suggesting that some of the history here might be a little biased in that I was directly involved. So that's just a health warning, but hopefully everything I say is well evident. Right, we'll go on to the, right, you just said it now, okay. Before I actually explain what the pink guide was and its function, I think I should remind us all about the historical context of this period, which seems so long ago, yet it wasn't. Firstly, criminalisation. Most students at the universities in the Greater Manchester area who had a partner or sexual relations with other males would be committing a criminal act up to the 94 Act, reduced it to 18, but still equality before the law did not arrive until 2000. And still today, 71 countries criminalise intermale sexual behaviours, and half of those are actually Commonwealth countries, which strongly suggests where the what they might call anti-gay laws originated from, i.e. the British administrators who gave them a legal code. Thank you, Shelley. Also, this period I'm dealing with had the legacy of the Local Government Act, pushed through by the Conservative government, which explicitly stated that families of two men was a pretend relationship. And that was a Local Government Act, as it says on the screen there. It was originally 28, but when it became law, it had gone into Section 2A. And in theory, any teacher that suggested inequality of relationships was open to prosecution. It was never applied, but that doesn't mean it didn't have an effect. In fact, anyone who was in education at the time was very wary of it, and it just reinforced the taboo, and it was an agenda which did not speak to equality, in quite the reverse. So what I'm trying to do here is just create an atmosphere of which the context of the Pink Guide was launched. This was a period when HIV/AIDS was deadly. Those who lived through that period know the terrors of that. And added to the threat of becoming infected yourself was the role of the mass media, who quickly recruited the disease as another way of bashing diversity, of undermining an equality agenda. And I think I've got some front pages. So you're a young student in Manchester, and you've been brought up in that context. And this is what the papers are showing. Even the government advertisement at the time, and those old enough to remember it, John Hurt speaking over an advert of tombstones with age written on them. No information of what it was, how it was transmitted. It was a gay plague. At the time, I was actually working on building sites. I'm a joiner by trade, and there was real fear in my workmates that they didn't share my mug because I was known to be gay, and they didn't know if they would get AIDS through drinking from the same mug as me. Such was the level of ignorance. Where present pandemic, we're given lots of information. Washing hands, wearing a mask, get the vaccination, i.e. transmission is transparent. We know how the virus is transmitted. Believe it or not, in the 90s, when this was a deadly disease, how it was transmitted was still in the dark for lots of people. I would argue that's deliberate, but I'm not going into that. So activism, LGBT plus activism, was literally about keeping people alive, giving them that information and promoting what was then called safer sex, i.e. stopping the transmission. The AIDS virus was very fragile. Any exposure to it, it died. Not like the present virus we're dealing with now. So telling people how to protect themselves was absolutely essential. Many gay pride and lesbian parades stopped. Such was the energy that had to be put into literally keeping people alive. I mentioned the obscure adverts the government put on. And also at this time, student societies, LGBT societies in colleges, were very small. In fact, if you had 10 members out of a student body of 10,000, that was a big society. You didn't want to be identified. You didn't want to be out, especially with all that negative publicity coming out. You're a plague carrier, etc., etc., etc. So very few student activists were around at this time. So in the early 90s, we actually set up something called the Pink Collective, which was just bringing together those few activists to work against. I don't think we had sat down and worked out the theory. We just wanted to celebrate who we were and our sexuality. And the Pink Collective just was a forum where we brought all the student activists together. So you actually had a room of more than 10 people and organised a series of events. Regular social events, non-commercial and commercial. We, at the end of the academic year, we hired a youth hostel in North Wales and all went off for the week. We involved a lot of alcohol, I seem to remember, and lots of other things. But part of that was the production of something called the Pink Guide, of which I have a copy here. And we produced it for 5 years. Those are the covers for 5. And what it was just a free magazine. Anyone who's been to college knows that you're in the first week or two, you're given lots of information. There's piles of it. And this was one of the publications. Self-funded by advertising, put together voluntarily. And at first, one here, bit amateurish by the looks, but given out. And it was a promotion of diversity. Clear and simple. And if we move on. And the pages contain basic information. Information about the societies themselves, information relating to health, information relating to the scene and non-scene. And this gives you some idea. This is the Greater Manchester scene. This is the North East edition of the Pink Guide. We expanded as we went on, and this was that's quite like the time bridge in the background there. Next. Issues to do with coming out, help organisations, but not specifically for LGBT students, but for all students. It was an educational publication that went against all that negative background and context I spoke about. You'll also notice the deliberate attempt for the high quality of the publication. That in itself is a signal. It again sends out a proper message. And that again is important to counteract that negative background that you've just seen. So those are the aims. It's also included targeting HIV/AIDS. We didn't want students to die. That seemed a reasonable aim. And in the pages of all of the 5 Pink Guides, there was safe sex information, which was explicit. And there's a reason for explicit. The government information at the time said Most of the people who engaged in sexual behaviour, risky as it was called then, sexual behaviour with other men, don't talk about it. Such is the level of the taboo that there's not kind of foreplay here. Let's go courting, let's go cinema, yeah, maybe stay over in a few weeks' time. Casual sex was perhaps what the only way intimacy could be enjoyed by many of our closeted students. Therefore, the information had to be immediate. No, just read this pamphlet, it'll only take you an hour. It doesn't happen like that. If you are closeted, you actually see yourself in part as being quite disgusted with that. So it has to be visual. And you'll see here in this, it's just a simple cartoon. We also had health information for women as well. Whoops. The student unions and universities did not like us trying to protect our fellow students. The second time we produced the Pink Guide, what was the Polytechnic is now MMU, banned the guide. And they cited Obscene Publications Act, ultra-vires. I think there's 5, 6 reasons they gave, all of them spurious. What they didn't like was this very high-profile celebration of sexual diversity, and certainly nothing to do with sex, which I actually don't think is limited to LGBT. If anyone has been to an undergraduate lecture on birth control and the STD nurses coming along, you'll get the idea that this isn't a thing that should be encouraged. Yeah, it's the British at the worst, I think. We were 2 years later, we produced a government poster, which was a sheathed penis going up a bottle. And the argument here is that was the quickest way of getting that information over to those that wouldn't read it. No, they banned it. They banned our Lesbian and Gay Society at Salford. I was chucked out of the University Students' Union, along with the other members of the Lesbian and Gay Society, and the other university societies and universities themselves endorsed the ban. So, on the grounds that the information was offensive. The fact that it might save their students' lives, the important point in this was secondary. I'm not making this up. The offence caused to certain members of the population, student population, was sufficient to justify not giving information to their students to save their lives. Just let you marinate with that one. It's incredible insight. And this is the subsequent year after the banning. The ban was lifted. We eventually got it lifted. And we had a big protest on campus and what have you. And 20 odd years ago, 20 years later, I was invited along with the secretary of the society who'd been expelled from the union and were made life members by the student union. And they've made a film, which is quite good. But I just want to finish on this note. My university, my first university, Salford University, actually endorsed the ban. Got the minutes of the meeting with the registrar. This disgusting information should not be shared. And after I was given, and Simon was given a life membership, it was a kind of an apology for being kicked out of the student union, which was actually illegal. I wrote to the Vice Chancellor's office and said, did we get an apology from you? I usually send a letter every 3 months, reminding them they've not answered that. They won't even retract. But what I like is they've had a rainbow crossing put on the A6 outside of my own university. So they can do this, but that legacy of actually saying, actually upsetting some of our students because that information is offensive, although it can save lives, stands. And I pick on this university because it's my first university.
But there are lots of examples of the university sector now jumping on board, covering themselves in pink paint. They can't find it. We run out of pink paint sometimes at these universities, but not that retrospective lens. What have we done wrong? How can we make it right? And just in finishing, just on that point, Alan Turing, you remember chemical castration was his sentence. That was administered regularly by the university hospital that is now MRI, who also researched on how to cure queer. So yes, the queering of the universities is great, but it has to be sincere. And the Pink Guide provides an example of not the finest moment. And I think it gives us an insight of the lengths people would go to justify not sharing health information, which literally saved lives. Okay.
Has anybody got any questions?
Why do you think, sorry, really enjoyed that.
Thank you.
I'm currently a student at UOM, so it kind of grinds to hear it. But, why do you think that, particularly the Chancellor of Salford, Vice Chancellor of Salford, is ignoring your message? Is there a fundamental reason?
It's a good question. I mean, telepathy is not my strong point, as you can imagine. I would say that I've singled out Salford, but Manchester, University of Manchester was as bad. In fact, it was horrible to somebody with LGBT activists at the time. Going back to your question of what stops them now putting the hand up saying, we got that wrong, we're sorry, closure. How can we make sure it doesn't happen again? What can we learn? Unless you apologise for something, you don't learn. You know, forget.
You're not realising you've done it.
Absolutely, absolutely. So they don't think they've done anything wrong, I think is the answer to that. I think there's also an element of embarrassment. There they are, one of the supporters of Pride in their area. They've got an LGBT staff society. So look, they're on the Stonewall, whatever it's indicator. And this is rather embarrassing, and we'd rather it go away. And in my life as an activism, I've learned that you don't go away. You just keep knocking on the door. And if you don't hear you first, you just knock louder. And this is what one of the aims of this presentation. This issue is not going away, Salford. And as long as I have breath, I will make sure, because it's an important point. You can only move on once they go, yeah, that was wrong.
Would it not perhaps be quicker for them if they would, to a degree, go away if they acknowledge it? They would become their history.
It would absolutely would go away. What I'm using collectively, what we want is equality. It's what most human beings want. Respect. It's not a big thing, yet it is. In a society that is unequal. So you just keep knocking at the door. I mean, how long have people in this room been doing that? But you don't have an option, I don't think. It's not if you get knocked over. The question is always is whether you get up again. To be knocked down again, and then the question again, do you get up again? The reason, this is such a remarkable event, that LGBT History Month in this country is such a remarkable event. The fact that we go, oh yeah, oh it's February again, yeah, I'll have to buy a badge. People around the world that would love an event like this. This would be illegal. This would be unimaginable. I think there's a county in Alabama that has just been, their library's been told to remove all its LGBT plus books from its shelves. That's in so-called the liberated West. You just keep knocking. What the Vice Chancellor's thinking, I'd rather not go there. We know what we want him to do. But the other societies that are involved in the banning of safe-sex information, it's incredible. University of Manchester, MMU. The northeast version I showed you a picture of, we produced a Yorkshire, northeast and northwest versions. And all the northeast ones were destroyed in an alleged fire. So they dumped off the University of Northumbria. And I was telephoned 2 days later to say that they'd suddenly been set on fire. And so they'd all found their way to the rubbish dump. So I think there's 6 copies of the Northeast Pink Guide from 1994. Just make one comment about this high quality. I have to flag up Gareth Williams, who's now teaches philosophy at Lancaster, and the energy he put into this production is amazing. He could be seen with a glass of wine most nights heading to his Mac to bash out this thing. It's a remarkable document. And the team involved, all volunteers. So over our summers, we just raised money and got a copy for this. And it was a wonderful achievement. I would feel very proud to be part of it. But added to that, they tried to ban it. And did, or burn it.
We have a couple of questions
All
from
right.
online, Jeff. So
Go on.
somebody's saying they haven't caught your name. So if you could let them know your name. And then the esteemed Sue Saunders is asking for more about Stephen Twigg.
Do we hear her, or is it?
Yes. She's muted at the moment.
Oh, right, Sue. You want to know about Stephen Twigg? Right, okay. So,
And if you can repeat your name
yeah,
as well.
okay. Right, Sue. Stephen Twigg, who was a member of the British Cabinet, openly gay member of the British Cabinet, who at the time was the convener of the National Union of Students Lesbian Gay LGBT plus campaign, which is an independent campaign within NUS. And we have an annual conference, or we did have, and we elect the convener. And he was found consorting with our enemies, advising them how to put down these pink guide people who were causing problems for embarrassing the NUS by promoting offensive government safe-sex information. So we had a conference, the annual conference in Manchester that year, 93. And the motion of no confidence was put against him, and it was overwhelmingly passed. So he's the only convener of the NUS Lesbian and Gay campaign to be sacked for aiding the enemy in the suppression of safe-sex information. The fact that he went on to be an MP and a government minister, I only saw him twice after that, and he didn't seem to want to talk to any of us, which was very, very strange. He wanted to forget that period. Yes, the NUS was controlled by Labour students at the time, and they put a lot of energy into trying to suppress the pink guide. They found it incredibly embarrassing to be linked to effective safe-sex information. Government safe-sex information. So that's how radical it was. But providing that information for undergraduates and postgraduates was considered a serious threat. I'll let you make your own conclusions. Does that answer that, Sue? You're muted.
Yes, darling. Thank you so much.
Always a pleasure, Sue. Always a pleasure to have you on my shoulder.
I could say, where's your badge?
Yes, I gave them all away, as you told me to, Sue.
Okay, I'll send you some more.
Thank you. Got a question here.
How does it make you feel knowing that you worked so hard to get Section 28 grant and in the 80s and 90s? How does it make you feel now that we're kind of on the edge of Section 28 for the trans community?
We've had so many victories. We know how to win. bring it on. Having this was the best thing they did for safe sex information ever in Manchester. Once you told the students that this was banned, I could have sold each one of these for £10. Demand rocketed. I didn't say it at the time. My public face was shocking, terrible. But we all knew that more people would see that safe sex message, know they banned it, than ever if it didn't ignore it. So the vice chancellors and the presidents of the student unions, in their attempt to suppress effective safe sex information, actually promoted it. So yes, I could have given them a hug, but obviously I didn't because they banned me from the university and what have you. But that's just one of the examples of keep winning.
We need to do something for patients.
They'll do it. Then you just get the spotlight, turn it on them. That's the critical moment, making sure that you keep the spotlight on, because the cowards. Remember that. They're the cowards. Any other questions?
Just got something in the chat. We'll just check what that is. Oh, thank you, Shelley, it says.
Okay. Thank you very much.
So that was an outstanding talk. So thank you so much to Dr. Jeff Evans, who has legged it back from Sicily to be here with us today through wind and rain. And I am so very grateful that he managed to get here, because that is a moment we did not want to miss.
The high point was Doncaster waiting room at 3:30 this morning with 120 other refugees trying to get back to Manchester via Leeds.
Yes, so yes, I think another round of applause for that. And this leads us to our final and fourth speaker of the day. This is a video recording, and it is sent to us by Dr. David Clarke, who is a writer based in London, and he has worked for many years as an academic and has published widely on medieval gender and sexuality and contemporary uses of the Middle Ages. His queer medievalist crime novel, Come the Dark Night, debuts with Bloodhound Books in May 2022 under his pen name of David Tregarthen. So do go out there and enjoy that book if some of the things that David is talking about are things you would like to explore more in fiction. His talk is entitled Sexual Acts and Identities in the Middle Ages, and we welcome David now to the screen.
Hello everyone, my name is Dr. David Clarke, and I'm a writer who's done research and taught on medieval gender and sexuality for many years. So I'm delighted to be able to talk about that topic as part of Outing the Past. The Middle Ages are often stereotyped as a time of ignorance and persecution of minorities, or a time before LGBT+ people even existed. However, if we look more closely at the literature and art of the period, a much more complex picture emerges. Medieval writers and artists represented and talked about same-sex or queer relationships and gender-variant individuals in lots of different ways, celebrating them as well as condemning them. I want to talk a bit about that and about different ways of approaching non-heteronormative identities in the past. Obviously, in 15 minutes or so, I'll only be able to scratch the surface, but I'd be delighted to try and answer any questions you might have after the talk or via email, and I'd love to hear what you think. I'm going to try not to assume any prior knowledge, so just to clarify, when I talk about the Middle Ages or medieval literature, I'm referring to a period of around 1,000 years from AD 500 to 1500, give or take. We tend to divide medieval English literature into two broader periods: Old English, which is mainly before the Norman Conquest, and Middle English, which is afterwards and up to the Renaissance period. There are a lot of popular myths circulating about the Middle Ages and about what medieval people were like, or believed, or did. For instance, the idea that their lives were nasty, brutish, and short, and the period was exceptionally violent. In fact, you could argue the last 100 years have seen far more extreme violence, whether in terms of genocide or technological and chemical warfare. And the low medieval average life expectancy is pulled down by a massive infant mortality rate caused by lack of vaccinations. If you lived beyond childhood and avoided wars, you might well live to around 60 or 70 years old. There's also lots of misconceptions or overgeneralizations about medieval attitudes to gender and sexuality. And I want to explore some of these today, and some of the questions and problems we have to deal with when we're thinking about this kind of history. For a number of reasons, I'm going to start by talking about sex, and then move on to sexuality. So the following is an Old English riddle from a manuscript known as the Exeter Book. I had heard of something growing in a corner, swelling and standing out, lifting up its covering. A bride grasped at that boneless thing, proud-hearted with her hands. With her robe, the prince's daughter concealed that swelling thing. Raised eyebrows, right? Well, I'm sure everyone listening realizes the answer to that riddle is, of course, dough. We're asked to imagine a woman kneading dough with her hands, then perhaps using her apron or robe to place it in the oven in the corner, where the heat will cause it to rise and become bread. But if you thought of a sexual solution rather than the Great British Bake Off, don't worry, you're not the only one. Medieval monks loved the double entendre and the pose of moral outrage. Oh, Brother Alfred, did you think it was about sex? I'll pray for you. There are several riddles like this in the Exeter Book, and they're spoken by objects such as keys, pokers, helmets, dough, and churns. The trick is that they make the reader think that they are really describing sex or genitals by describing them as stiff or hanging down or hairy underneath. It's a bit like a Stephen Fry panto at Christmas. As well as various other objects, other riddles include a slave woman using a leather sex aid by the fire, a cockerel and hen having sex in a courtyard, and even the biblical character Lot getting incestuous with his daughters. So the early English were certainly not all wide-eyed innocents or prudes. But do these texts actually tell us anything about how the early English really thought about sex, or the kinds of sex they had, and how often, or whether they had a concept of sexuality? And those things are actually quite tricky. One of the reasons for that is that medieval sex is most discussed in penitentials. So those are lists of sins according to the church, and the various penances that confessors should give sinners for committing them. Sex with another man's wife might mean fasting for the whole winter. A wet dream could entail singing 23 psalms, or sex with another man might involve 7 to 10 years penance. The problem is we have no way of knowing how this related to real life. Just because a sex act is mentioned doesn't mean that anyone actually performed it necessarily. We don't know how often real medieval men had sex with one another, for instance. We don't know whether they bothered to confess it to a priest, or if the priest actually gave them the penance he was supposed to. As we know, priests don't always follow the rule book, any more than politicians. There may then have been a big gap between theory and practice. For if you obeyed the church strictly, even sex within marriage was off the table for most of the year. Not during various feast and fast days, not while a wife is menstruating, not while a wife is heavily pregnant or for 40 days after she gives birth, not on Tuesday, Thursday, Saturday, and Sunday nights, not during daylight. And the type of sex you could have was also pretty limited in theory. No oral or anal sex, no masturbation, no positions other than the so-called missionary position, and no sex unless your express intention is to produce children and you're not enjoying it too much at the time. It seems unlikely ordinary people obeyed these prohibitions to the letter. And this is backed up by passages like one where Bede, sometimes called the Venerable Bede, complains about a monastery in Colton. He says this: "Men and women alike were either sunk in unprofitable sleep, or else awake only to sin. Even the cells which had been built for prayer and study were converted into places for eating, drinking, gossip, or other amusements." So even monks and nuns, it seems, sometimes ignored the church's rules on drinking, gluttony, and fornication. And that's where literature comes in. It opens up a bigger picture than just sex acts, good or bad. It represents sexuality more generally, with all of its overlapping emotional, mental, and physical dimensions. And literary texts can sometimes demonstrate a particularly relaxed attitude. For instance, there are several Latin poems which are quite homoerotic, including one in which Ganymede successfully argues that gay sex is more fun than straight sex. Later on in the medieval period, an Italian writer called Boccaccio, who influenced Chaucer, tells a story in which a young man seduces another man's wife. When the husband discovers what's going on, he just demands that the young man sleep with him as well, and they carry on a happy ménage à trois. Chaucer himself also plays with gender and sexuality in the Canterbury Tales, and in his partner includes a queer-coded pilgrim. The French romance, Le Roman de Silence, centres on a character who is born female but brought up as male, and the text contains a detailed debate about nature and nurture, particularly around gender and gendered expectations. And finally, as just one more example, the Norse god Loki is represented in some of the literature as being what we might now call sexually fluid and gender fluid. One of the issues we have to think about, though, if we want to move from talking about sex to talking about sexual identity, is what terms or labels to use. I'm sure you're all familiar with a range of terms of sexuality, like gay, straight, bi, queer, pansexual, asexual, and many more. But despite this, even now, a lot of people basically work on the assumption that there is a simple binary, where people are either gay or straight. And we see this in the media all the time, of course. Given how dominant this gay-straight binary is, it may surprise you to learn that this way of thinking only became dominant around 150 years ago. Before that, most texts tend to talk more about what people do rather than what they are. The famous literary philosopher Michel Foucault is often quoted as saying that the homosexual was invented in the 19th century out of a combination of medical and psychological studies. But what often gets lost in the story of the invention of homosexuality as a concept is that heterosexuality as a concept was invented then too. All too often, scholars assume that because the word gay didn't exist in the past, for instance, therefore everyone was essentially straight. Research, in fact, shows that people then were much like people now, complicated. They had complex individual personal lives with various sexual and emotional histories and interests. And we can see this complexity reflected in the literature if we let go of modern assumptions. The problem that we have to deal with, and which scholars disagree about, is that the terminology for our modern divisions of sexuality didn't exist in the past. So the question is, does the fact that the word gay or bi or trans didn't exist mean that gay and bi and trans people didn't exist or couldn't understand sexuality? Well, that seems unlikely. We've already seen that a wide range of sexual activities existed in the Middle Ages, and it's also clear that people knew some individuals had a sexual preference for the same sex. Medical writers like William of Salicito go into great anatomical detail trying to explain how and why this might be the case. On the other hand, medieval people don't seem to have divided sexual preferences up quite so rigidly as we have until recently. In fact, precisely the lack of rigid categories and terminology may have led to a more fluid sense of sexuality. But it's not just sexuality in terms of sex itself where we need to avoid modern assumptions. The dividing lines between what we might see as erotic and platonic relationships weren't the same either. There are all sorts of overlapping elements and dimensions to interpersonal relationships, then as now. The difference is in what the dominant picture is of how people relate to each other. For instance, in the Old English period, there's very little interest in romantic or sexual love between men and women, judging from the literature at least. The poetry is much more interested in love and passionate loyalty between men. If we turn to Beowulf, the most famous of all Old English texts, for instance. Beowulf was translated by Tolkien and Seamus Heaney. It's been the inspiration for many books and films. Its hero never marries, and his most intense relationships are with other men, particularly a younger warrior called Wiglaf. Old English poetry has a strong focus on passionately expressed feelings of intimacy and tender friendship between men. When Beowulf is locked in a fight to the death with a fiery dragon, Wiglaf is the only one of Beowulf's warriors who runs to help him. He says that rather than save his own life by running away, God knows that I would much rather that fire should embrace my body with my gold giver. Wiglaf vows to share his armour and sword with Beowulf, and Beowulf nominates him to inherit his goods and kingdom after his death. These kinds of intense personal bonds are often seen as a permanent, lifelong commitment, as in the following maxim or proverb from the Exit book. Wretched is he who shall live alone. Fate has ordained him to dwell friendless. It were better for him that he had a brother. Always shall those warriors carry weapons and sleep together. Let one never slander them before death separates them. In some ways, the worst imaginable fate for the early English is to lose their beloved friend or companion. In King Alfred the Great's translation of a text called The Consolation of Philosophy, it's made explicit that friendship is even more important than marriage. The narrator says this: some strive after women with much eagerness, so that through them they may get children, especially, and also live pleasantly. The true friend, then, I say, is the most precious thing of all these worldly blessings. At one point, the speaker says that even if his friend distracted him away from God, he would still refuse to give him up. Ich he will have love, he says. I will have him nonetheless. So what we find when we leave behind modern expectations and assumptions is that medieval literature shows a much wider latitude for emotional and sexual intimacy for all people. The picture we get is one of a whole range of competing and conflicting types of bonds and relationships, and along with that, some flexible attitudes to gender and sexuality, which some scholars find uncomfortable. Now, it's not a utopian ideal by any means. Medieval culture does not just hold attitudes we might perceive as startlingly modern. At the same time, it demonstrates assumptions we find deeply problematic. The embrace of homosexuality often goes hand in hand with misogyny, for instance. The medieval imaginary is not uniform and unchanging. But that's what I find really interesting about the medieval period. Reading texts produced hundreds of years ago can help us evaluate modern attitudes and categories from a different perspective. We can recognize that attitudes and cultural values are not monolithic. They change over time, as do the ways that we talk about and understand them. And at the same time, they can demonstrate that we weren't all straight in the past. We can look, therefore, to the past for representations that don't fit into heteronormative straitjacket, and representations that can alternately entertain, disturb, and empower. I hope you found this whistle-stop tour of medieval sex and sexuality interesting. If you'd like to find out more, my book, Between Medieval Men, published by Oxford University Press, explores the Old English material in more detail. Or do drop me an email if you have any questions I might be able to help with. Thank you for listening.
You're up.
Hello and welcome back, everybody. Thank you so much today to our in-person and our online audience for attending Stockport Library's Outing the Past Festival. A massive shout out and thank you to our 4 speakers, Andy Jones, Dr. David Clarke, Dr. Jeff Evans and Alex Holmes. It's very much appreciated the time, effort and insight that you have brought to our Outing the Past Festival at Stockport. We are also in Stockport having a couple more events in person here in Stockport Central Library. On Saturday the 20th of February we have a history talk with Jill Rossini, which is from 2 till 4, and on the 26th of February we have from 10 till 12 2 speakers who are discussing living with HIV. You can turn up on the day or they are bookable online at www.stockportplus.org/history. I would like to thank everybody so much for attending. We are going to post a survey up in the chat in a moment, a Survey Monkey survey about this talk, and we would very much appreciate your feedback. So if you can take the time to fill that in for us, please look out for that in the chat in the next few minutes. And thank you all so much for your time and attending.
I need the stuff for the chat. Go ahead. Just alt-tab back to the other screen. Don't stop recording.